Can you tell us firstly a little bit about what you mean by process before content?
When I think about what does structured decision making look like, I like to think about it as 4 core principles. And the first of those, they appear in no particular order. So the first one we want to talk about is this thing called process before content. Now that sounds a bit like a kind of technical terminology, but the idea is that you want to think about how you're going to make a decision before you get stuck into the decision. So when I say content, I mean, what are the things that we're trying to decide between? What do we care about? What options might we be considering? That's what I think of as content. Process is, so how do we say whether one thing is better than another, whether we like one thing over another? And we need to get that process set up first before we get to actually looking at what are the content and the options that we might consider, for example. I guess I've been doing this for 15 years, so I've got many different examples, some of which, of course, I can't talk about, but that's part of the intrigue. But when I think about a structured decision process that we want to get set up before we even get into the decision, let's think about maybe a large organization that's trying to restructure its organization. And when we think about what process looks like, it might look like first plan out the decision, actually sit down and work out what are the different pieces of the decision. Then next, bring together the components of those decisions, get some data, get some information, get some understanding of what the different parts in the decision might be. So that's another step in the decision process. Then it might be, how do we combine those different things together? What might be some workshops that we need? So that's another step in the process. Then it might be, how do we put all that together with some recommendations and some information? That's another step in the process. And then maybe the last step in the process might be take that to, I don't know, some senior decision makers, maybe a board of directors, maybe a governance committee, something like that. And so all those are steps in the process of decision making, not the content. None of that is talked about whether it's a good idea to do more marketing, more sales, less production. That's all the content. So in that example, that process might take 6 months, 9 months. So it could be a really lengthy process. And for a large organization, hundreds of millions of dollars, that may well be what's required for such an important decision for them.
How do you know when's the right time to switch between process and content?
That's a great question. And because, of course, I'm a consultant, mostly I'm going to be saying it depends to an answer to many of your questions. So, morning coming.
Yes.
And actually, perhaps I'll answer the question in a subtly different way. What we're trying to achieve by doing process before content is to, I guess, come to the contentious stuff later. If we start a decision process with the content, we almost invariably start with people who've got opinions that come out of the woodwork straight away. This is the thing we should do. Now I'm going to justify why we need to do it. And that content conversation then derails any chance of maybe a balanced process, maybe engaging people. And so when's the time to move from process to content is when you've got process agreed, where everyone who's involved says, yeah, we're clear. This is how we're going to make that decision. Okay, once we're clear, are we all clear? Yeah, we know we really are clear. Okay, now we're clear. Now we'll start thinking about what's a good thing to do or a bad thing to do. Because, of course, well, many reasons why process before content, but in that situation, if it starts to turn into an argument, we can stop and go, where's the process? Are we on track? We all agreed on this process? Yeah, we agreed on the process. Okay, well, we're off that process, so let's get back to it. So it gives us a place to come back to when the going gets pretty tricky.
Now, you're an engineer by trade, is that correct?
How'd you guess?
Well, I was just thinking about how it must be pretty clear to you. I think you even mentioned the importance of data in this process, that you, at the beginning part, that you put data into that mix. So it would occur to me that as an engineer, all along that way, you'd have very clear metrics on when it's actually ready, you're ready to make that decision. Would that be fair to say?
Yep, data is definitely an important part in decision making.
Yes. Now, at the same time, Paul, I'm just going to take a completely different perspective on this, just because as you're talking about this, I'm thinking about the simple thing called how does one make a decision to buy a piece of furniture. Now, I know that seems like a very dumbed down version of what you're doing, right? But I was thinking about it because I have this relationship with my husband, right? He likes to weigh up decisions a lot.
Yep.
And he always wants to make sure we have the right kind of, you got to check your options here. Don't go by the first one. Now, I'm the opposite, right? I see a lounge and I like it. It seems to me like a good price, maybe because the marketing's pretty good and it tells me it's 50% off. I think it's a great deal. And so I go, no, we should buy it. Now, I will admit and confess to you, there have been many times I've gone and made a decision like that, and then immediately afterwards I have that cognitive dissonance where immediately after I go, yeah, maybe I should not have made that decision, right?
Yes, yep.
So when you share this thing about process and content, that's what I'm reminded of. So I go, at what point for myself,
Yes, yep.
right, do I go, my husband is right, I should wait and then allow for us to make some options, and then at what point do I go, okay, now let's make the decision? Now, I know you can't answer my marital problems, but you know, given that I've given that example, I'd say, how can we apply it to that kind of scenario?
Yeah, it's a great, and I love that scenario because I can hear the difference between he's driving process going, let's consider some options, let's look at ways to evaluate them, and you're driving content going, that lounge looks great, I'll have that, thanks very much. And so, of course, the answer is to meet in the middle. There's one of the terms I use a lot in decision making is trade-offs. There's always a trade-off. There's a trade-off between, I want the thing right now, let's just go out and buy it, versus, oh no, maybe in 6 months' time, I want to be enjoying my lounge and going, I've made a good decision, I'm happy about that. And so how do you manage that trade-off? And that's really where, I guess what I'd say is, I'm trying not to use the technical term. The technical term I'd use is requisite, which is kind of good enough. But really what you want is process that's good enough for the job that you're up to. So your lounge is a good example. Probably the whole family are going to be enjoying that. They're going to spend time sitting on it. And who knows what memories are going to be made on that lounge. And so really, even though you like the 50% off sticker, I'd wager that you're committed to making a good decision about it and having something that will live with your family for some time.
Okay, so I hear something that I probably haven't noticed before. You use the word, was it trade-offs? You said trade-offs? Yeah. I don't think I've ever considered the trade-offs. In fact, I don't think I've ever sat down and said, what are all the things that I want? Like, what are my expectations out of this in terms of comfort, colour? What do I want from it, right?
Yes, yeah.
Versus what do I think my husband, what's his criteria? I don't actually think we've ever stopped in that part of the process to say, what is our would we call that a decision criteria? Does that exist?
That's exactly what I would call that.
Okay, great.
Those are decision criteria, yes.
Yeah, and it sounds like that seems like a critical thing to be doing in the early part of the process stage. Is that fair to say?
Exactly, yeah. And I would call having a conversation about decision criteria as process. So even the idea that we might need some decision criteria would be, we've thought about we need a process. The process might be decide on our decision criteria. And so, yeah, that's a great illustration that says, when I think of process before content, in that case, one step in the process is let's agree our decision criteria. Now, back to my corporate example, that might be a 3-month process. For you, that might be a 3-minute conversation with your husband. This doesn't need to be the world's largest and longest decision.
So time's not necessarily the player, so you're saying?
No, absolutely, yeah. It's really, it is the principle that says, okay, we've thought about the different steps here. One step is let's agree our decision criteria. Another step then might be, knowing our criteria, how might we say whether one lounge is better compared to another? That's another piece of process. Again, it might simply be we walk into the store, we've got our criteria written down, and we tick off on the list, yeah, this one does well. That's definitely a decision process. And it's allowed, what you may have noticed, by thinking about that first, has allowed you to at least give yourself the opportunity to not just jump at the 50% off sticker.
Okay. Well, now you have flicked to that part of my brain, which is the science part, and my love for neuroscience, as you well know. Sounds like I've got to do a little bit more thinking from my creative prefrontal cortex brain versus my limbic emotional brain. Do you talk much about that in the area of processes?
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, now that you mentioned that, there's a lot of, I guess, neuroscience behind what makes structured decision-making work. Particularly given that our brains are the thing that's running the show, whether we like it or not.
That's right.
And given all these different parts of our brains often are fighting with each other, the logic is fighting with the emotion, is fighting with the response. And I certainly know what's responding when you walk in and see the 50% off. That's not necessarily the logical part of your brain. So, and this is a whole other world called cognitive bias. This is how our brain is driving our decisions when we don't necessarily want them to. And it looks like many things. For example, you might have a cognitive bias to a certain color, and if you happen to see that color in the lounge, whether or not it's uncomfortable, whether or not it's expensive, just the fact that it's purple might have you go, I've got to have that lounge. And how do we process helps us interrupt some of that stuff. It helps us pause that immediate reaction and go, no, I'm just going to give this a bit of consideration. And again, it doesn't have to be a 3-month consideration. It might simply be, I've seen the purple couch, we're going to have it. Let's go and grab a coffee and after we've had our coffee, come back and see if we still have the same emotional response. And often that bit of process called just pause for a second can be invaluable in not having us have a house full of junk that we don't want.
Yes, well, you should know I don't have any such thing called cognitive bias. I just have the right answer. I don't think anybody has to say, no, I don't have any particular bias. It is the way.
And funnily enough, you and everybody else.
Yeah, exactly. Well, there's a couple of other things that I hear in what you're saying, Paul. Firstly, I think if we go through this process in itself, right, just to distinguish the difference between process and content, let's first say, even being able to identify that, right?
Yep.
To see that there is a difference between process and content. Is there anything you want to say about that?
Yeah, I think that's and I'll say a little bit more about that. And again, don't want to get too wrapped up in my own engineering, and process isn't.
No, please do.
When I say the word process, many people hear different things.
Right.
I'm talking about decision process. How might we choose left or right? Now, the process of getting finance to pay for the couch, that's another process. That is, I've got to fill in 27 forms. I might have to phone up and proof address and all those other things. That isn't what I mean by decision process. So sometimes, a bit like I said earlier, some people say, oh, yes, we've got process. That's clear. I know exactly the process I need to buy this couch. It's like, no, the process isn't how I get the finance or which credit card I use. The process is the decision process. Should we buy one? Which one? So it's really important, particularly when we're working with those large organizations, to get clear on what do we mean by process first.
Oh, so good you said that, right? So I just did a Google search, right? So we have process. Let's be clear about this. Well, and who's to say Google's right? You can challenge me on this one. So process is a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. So firstly, Paul, I got to say, right, that might be simple, but it sounds like the very first step in the process of process and content is to even agree on the actual identified steps in the process. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. And in fact, that's one of the reasons why this is a core principle, because frankly, if you've got a bunch of people, your husband, your family, or your board of directors involved in a decision, it's much easier to have an agreement on the process than it is to agree on the decision. The agreeing on the decision is always the contentious bit. I think it should be purple. No, it should be red. No, it should be green. We're now at odds with each other. Whereas let's agree how we're going to decide which way it is. Oh, yeah, that's a much more fun conversation to have, or a much more productive conversation. So starting there starts with a sense of agreement and engagement and people wanting to participate in the decision process before you get into the fight that says, I want purple, no, I want green.
Okay, can we go in on that one a little bit more?
Yeah.
So about who gets a say in the fight?
Yeah.
So clearly in my scenario that occurs like it is a decision that my husband should be involved in the first place, which I think I could say, well, he doesn't get a say, right? So now I am also going to put this into the context as an entrepreneur, right? Because there are decisions that we're making, especially when you're in the startup of a business, around technical competencies and the things that we need to decide on in an area of expertise. And certainly I have struggled with that a lot because of my experience, and I have a broad range of experience across different areas. But my question is, how do you even determine who gets a seat? Let's put it this way: who gets a seat at the table in the first place? Who gets to make a say over the process and those steps in the process?
Oh, yeah, a great question. And let's just use your example. You might say, my husband doesn't get a say. I'm the one who chooses the furniture in this household. So my question back to you would be, so do you think he gets impacted by the decision that you made?
Yeah, and I don't care.
Well, you may say you don't care right now, but if every time he sits on the couch, he goes, God, what an uncomfortable couch, are you going to be happy about that? Probably not.
If I'm happy, I am. I'm sitting in a couch and it's comfortable. I'm like, I'm really?
Well, I suggest that if mostly what your experience of you sitting on that couch is him complaining about how bad it is, you're probably not that happy, really. So he is someone that's impacted by the decision, and that's really the question I'd ask is, if you think about a decision back to your entrepreneurial example, should I be consulting these experts? Should I be consulting my business partner? Should they be part of the decision process? First question I'd say is, are they actually impacted by the outcome of the decision? Because what happens is if they're not engaged and down the track the decision's made, they're not happy with it, there'll be a whole load of effort and energy put into them fighting against it, maybe trying to turn it over, maybe saying what a terrible decision. And that's probably not a great place to be. So your pleasure in enjoying your couch will be significantly impacted by all the complaints that might come at you for the terrible choice you made.
Now, look, I know I'm probably going to harp on this one a little bit, Paul, because in one of my last roles, I was accountable for change planning, change and strategy at News Corp, and $41 million project to downsize massive amount of print centres, manufacturing centres. And one of the things that stands out as a change manager is making sure you bring in the right people as far as stakeholders goes to make the decisions. And I think this was one of the things, my biggest complaint often was that, in fact, a lot of the decisions were stuck with the people who were in a certain team. Even though there were many other stakeholders who were involved, they weren't involved in the decision-making process, if I'm just quite clearly, right?
Yes.
So I do want to come at this again because I think also from what I'm seeing working with executives as clients, one of the biggest complaints they have is, well, they're not including us in the decision. We're just getting told what to do.
Yeah.
So what's your perspective about that?
Well, so one thing I'll say up front is one of our other principles is active stakeholder participation. So we're going to talk in more detail about that in a later episode. But
okay, sure.
The key, in fact, bringing it back, I guess, to the process conversation,
Yes.
it is entirely one of the helpful ways of having those stakeholders be part of and I guess ultimately own the decision, have some ownership in the decision, is to have them involved in the conversation of a process. So you can imagine, I'll keep bringing it back to your couch, but
that poor couch,
you
my
can
poor
imagine
husband.
the conversation over a cup of tea or whatever with your family to say, so how are we going to decide on a couch? So kids, what do you think? How would you choose a couch? Oh, I'd choose a couch by jumping up and down on it. Okay, well, there's a process. So you've engaged them in the conversation about the process for deciding on the couch. And that's a very helpful way of, so you can imagine that back to your change example. You could say, well, there's a bunch of people that are going to get impacted by this change. Maybe we can have a conversation with them on how should we make the decisions on some of this change. Again, not asking them what's the right change to make, what's the correct answer, but saying how are we going to decide on the best outcomes. So it really is this process conversation, this process piece of the jigsaw puzzle is a really helpful way to have people on board with where you're headed, and again start from a positive perspective, not from a I'm fighting for my corner, don't you take my piece of the business away.
Yeah, right. Great. Well, I've got nothing else on that one, so very good. Excellent. So let's move over to a bit more on the content side of things then. So once you've got the clarity between the fact that there is a difference between the process and the content.
Yep.
And then you've got a series of steps about agreeing on the process itself.
Yep.
Then you go through the process, then you have decisions around that, and you come to a point at the content. So let's just dig in there a little bit. So how do you know you're at the right point at that point, and what else would you say about that part of it?
So I guess that what I'm always thinking about, I guess one of the things that's always top of mind is a little like we just said, when we get past the decision, we get through a decision, how do we know that it's going to be accepted, it's going to be taken up by the stakeholders, it's not going to be fought against? And so that is always in my mind, is to keep testing that. And that's I guess we want to make sure we're well enough through the process before we start getting to the contentious stuff. And so that we also have a basis for dealing with the contentious stuff. Because of course, the whole point is human beings have opinions about things. You have an opinion about your couch, your kids do, your husband will do, the stakeholders involved in your change program will have an opinion about that. When do you bring that opinion to the table? That's what I would call the content. So you want to get to that point once everyone's feeling, okay, yeah, we've got a good way we're going to make this decision. We all think it's going to be effective. We support the basis of which we're going to make the decision, the process. So now let's roll our sleeves up and start throwing some opinions into the mix. It's also back to our conversation about the neuroscience and the cognitive bias. As soon as we start getting opinions, I want the purple couch, or I want my piece of the business to not get impacted by this change, we're now connected with a whole bunch of personal cognitive bias, wanting to hold on to what we've got, stick to the status quo, reduce loss, all those things that are driving our brains get associated as soon as we start dealing with the content. So we only want to bring that into the conversation once we're confident we have a way of dealing with that, rather than suddenly throwing our hands up and going, okay, we're stuck now. We're all fighting for opposite things here. We've got no way of moving forward. The whole thing is ground to a halt, which, of course, if you look at the world of negotiation, especially in the political world, often is what happens. I would say that's because you haven't gone far enough with the conversation around process. So you've got to feel like, yeah, we're good now to get stuck into the real nitty-gritty of the content.
Okay, so I'm hearing that there's a part in there that says there's a testing. I think you used the word test.
Yep.
So you've gotten to a point where there's a whole stack of opinions,
Yep.
and then you want to test that
Yep.
and to also test against potential risks. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's certain things in criteria itself to determine that even once you've reached the decision, Sounds like also the content part is where the decision starts to happen. Is that correct?
Exactly, yeah. And so I guess if I think about process, we talked about criteria for your couch. Criteria are a common piece in a structured decision-making process because they're a very good way, again, of us agreeing. So what are the things that matter to us? And different things matter to different people, and that all can come together through a kind of building up a set of criteria. Excuse me. And so I'd say that's the criteria are definitely content, and having the conversation about criteria also does keep at bay my thing's better than your thing, my purple's better than your green, because, oh, well, does color even matter to us? Well, let's have that conversation before we get to whether purple's better than green. So the discussion around criteria, why something might be better than something else, what's a good outcome for me, is a very helpful conversation that is about content, but still keeps on, I guess, not getting straight to the ultimate decision. Should we go left or right, do X or Y, buy green or purple? Now, let's back up from that a minute and have a conversation about criteria.
Okay, so I want to dig in again on something that you've said about that you brought up the part of the brain. Then what happens when you know that it's the decision and then you're stuck and you feel like you can't make it? So I'm just going to go straight to the word fear. I don't know if it's fear, but do you find, certainly in large organizations, given that you're dealing with not just large organisations, but large complexities and big budgets, right? I dare say that once you got to the point of content, that there could be a state of, I call it paralysis, but fear or whatever. What's your sense of that?
Yeah, and that is a common thing, especially large organizations where it might look like it's one individual that's responsible for the decision, yet the impact is going to be multi-billions of dollars. And so if we can see that happening, if leaders are starting to say, maybe we should put this off, maybe we're not ready, that sense of paralysis, I would often say, well, maybe there's something missing in your criteria, because actually your fear of your reputation. I make a decision, it's a bad decision, I get all over the press, and my reputation's in tatters. Well, then sometimes reputation, impacts on reputation might be part of your decision criteria. Let's take it back to your couch example. Some of the things that might have you be fearful would be, I really don't want everyone to come. I'm fearful that when I spill something on the couch, I'm then going to have to throw the whole couch away. Actually, so there's an impact on, I don't know, how easy the couch is to clean. Maybe that's a criterion you would never have thought of, but the fear of that is what might have you stop making your decision. So I'd say generally when it looks like fear's coming or there's paralysis in the decision, there's probably something missing in what you're considering in a decision. Let's look at that. Let's dig into that.
Okay, good. So now I want to redirect the angle of the consideration, specifically to making a decision to not do something. Because I know sometimes we spend a lot of time looking at decisions about taking an action to start doing something. But then there's other areas, often, and I don't know if you've noticed this, Paul, but it's certainly one of the things that I've noticed a lot with my clients is we have this habit as a human being to want to do more, buy bigger, get better, right? And I've tried in many occasions, in fact, one of the most effective tools if I find with clients is to have them stop doing stuff. But then they get, stuck and like, whoa, but if I do that, then this is going to happen. And how do I, and they're really scared to make decisions about saying no.
Yes, yeah.
And so do you have can you enlighten me in this part? Because now, listen, just so you know, on this one, I am going to anchor this one specifically around entrepreneurs, right?
Yes,
because in the current climate, especially, where there's a whole lot of uncertainty about staff, and many organisations at this point have spent, and look, I even use News Corp as an example, right? I spent 17 years out of my 23 years of media in News Corp. And we had two periods, right? In one period, we had 10 years of great, loads of money, put new resources in, do this and test this and new product, innovation, fantastic, right? Yep. And then the second 10 years of my career was all about disruption and just cut, right? Without necessarily doing the thinking about where was the right place to make the cut, let me just say, right? So, but in the moment, what I'm noticing a lot is in industries right now, and there's not name and shame, okay? There's no name and shame. There's no shame in this because we all do it. But there are many industries at the moment now who are having to confront some massive decisions. Yeah. Unfortunately for me, one of my clients and partners at Qantas, they've had to sack 20,000 people. Now, it's going to be pretty hard to rebuild an organisation with losing a lot of staff. So one of the things the lady said to me was, she said, actually, this is a time when we need to start working out what not to do anymore. She said, in fact, the role that I did have is very unlikely to exist when I come back. And I thought, wow, that's got to be tough. So is there a real difference for you when it comes to that point about making the decision to say no? Because I'm just afraid that if I say no, then maybe even though I know, technically speaking, it seems like it's the best decision to make, and on paper it looks like the best decision. But what do they call it? FOMO? Or sometimes is it FOMO, fear of missing out or something?
Yeah.
Like, what if I make the wrong decision and I stop doing this and that was really the right decision?
It's exact. I mean, this is such a current issue, and I think the environment today is really shining a light on it for us, I suppose. A couple of different things I heard in what you were saying. There's a doing nothing decision, which is we've got all these things we could buy, but actually we're going to buy none of it. And that's a hard decision, because often the kind of impetus is, buy more stuff, fill my house with more furniture, employ more people, whatever it might be. So how do we decide to do none of that? Well, I would always say in your decision process, you want to explicitly consider an option called doing nothing. And then when I can say doing nothing compared to buying this thing, why might that be a good thing? And when you start to think about, back to your criteria, risk, reputation, etc., often the doing nothing thing might be a very attractive option in that regard. So firstly, let's consider doing nothing as a very specific alternative compared to doing all the other things. Most people don't do that. They just consider, here's the 5 things, which one are we going to pick? And no one says, well, none of them is an option. So I think that's really important. I think the other thing I heard, which is a real challenge, especially we're going to see this as we come out of coronavirus and so on, is that what things to stop doing that we used to do or that we have been doing forever, or how do we maybe cut our cloak according to our cloth? How do we back off what we're doing? And frankly, we're doing a lot of work in that area right now. I won't say where, because I definitely don't want to name any names. But it's, as you might imagine, a common problem. One of the things I'd say there is, and this is a really interesting way of looking at the world, is to say, well, one of the most positive ways of thinking about stopping things is to imagine I've stopped everything. Imagine I've got none of the things I'm doing right now. Now I ask a different question. Instead of which things do I stop, I actually ask the question, which things do I put back in? So start with this, and this in the economics world is called zero-based budgeting. It's the idea of pretend I'm at nothing. I'm doing nothing. Now choose the things I put back in. And one of the reasons this is such a helpful way of thinking about decision making is it's applying a positive mindset to everything. Problem about our cognitive bias is we have a thing called loss aversion. We hang on twice as much to things we've already got as we do to things that we want in addition. And so, of course, when you say to an organization which things are you going to cut, everyone's holding on tight. I don't want to cut anything, but I want to add some new things, but I don't want to cut anything. Well, reframe it. Say, actually, we've already cut everything. You've got nothing at all. Now what do I put back in? It is one of the things I muse on in this current environment that we're in right now, is that most people in their lives have done that anyway by being forced to in isolation. I no longer get to go out to dinner. I now no longer get to go on holiday. A whole things in my life that were just normal, that if you asked me a year ago to stop doing, I go, no, I can't possibly stop doing that. Well, now I've had to. So most families and individuals are at a zero base.
Yes.
And so when we come up the back of this and things start reopening and so on, we're now going to have a positive choice. Actually, do I really want to go and spend that money on that dinner out tonight? Oh, maybe I don't. Okay, now I can look at it positively compared to spending the same money on going visiting my friends or whatever.
I really love that, Paul. And in fact, I think it's a really great way to end the session this week, because I think getting back to nothing is not something that it seems to be it's not a comfortable place for a lot of people. But the thing I personally love about that, Paul, I'm deeply passionate about people creating visions and new futures. And the real creativity in creating a new future does come from a place of nothing. And in fact, I'm reminded of an analogy, I'm sure in my days, one of my coaches saying to me something about a fruit bowl. Like if you've got a bowl and it's got dead fruit in it, It's not good enough just to take the dead fruit out. You've got to clean the bowl because there's bacteria left over. But when you clean the bowl out and you get back to nothing, you can put some beautiful fresh fruit in there, and then the fresh fruit's beautiful and fresh. It's not tarnished by anything. And that's really the opportunity of creating visions and purposes, right? Is you can start newly from nothing and create whatever you want and explore and whatever you want, and then make decisions from there. So have I understood that kind of clearly?
Exactly right, yeah.
Well, that's fantastic. And some beautiful, really crisp and clear, I think, insights around the difference between process and content. And I guess in any point, given the time we have right now, my number one takeout from this is, firstly, there is a series of understanding the processes itself and step-by-step itself. And being comfortable, I think, Paul, with nothing.
Yes.
Like really just allowing ourselves to be comfortable with stopping to not make a decision.
Yes.
Take things out of existence.
Yeah.
Get back to nothing, and then start to look at what some of the processes are that you could go through as if you were to start from scratch. What do you think?
Absolutely right, yeah. And I love that as a mindset, and we've been forced into it right now, so everyone's seeing what that feels like for themselves. Gives us a great chance to look forward and build for the future.